Okay, the hour has arrived. I will call a... There it is. Okay, the hour having arrived, I will call the Tuesday, July 23 meeting of the Park and Recreation Committee to order. And we have pretty much one topic to zero in on. Mr. Killian is going to be presenting in a few minutes, and he said that the Citizens for Clean Wausau group would be represented just by the one speaker. Is there anybody else that wants to impart any comments before we begin with that? Okay. Just so we kind of are up to speed on where we're at, I think we started talking seriously about testing back in January, and we got more serious about it as the year went on. In June, we received our environmental consultant's proposal that we wait and see what the Wausau aerial deposition study turned up and then go from there. But at that June meeting, the committee wanted to do more and wanted to do more than surface soil testing. And so at that meeting, we asked the consultant to prepare for our July 1 meeting a proposal with testing of subsurface and soil surface that would cover a greater area of the park. And Mr. Lassa from REI came back with a proposal to test at 20 spots around the park at a cost of around $71,000. He had a conflict. He couldn't come to that meeting. And so we thought, let's, have another meeting, a special session where he can be with us. And so that's why we're here and what we're doing. And during that discussion, the committee chose to ask the Citizens for Clean Wausau to tell us what they would suggest that we do at this point. So, Mr. Killian, if you want to get going here, it'd be great. And I am full confidence that you will be able to stay on the task of what we should be doing from here and not stray into, comments about other people's behavior along the way. We need to go, from this point forward. What do we do?
Yes, I'm not certain what the behavior comment meant, but I will certainly stick to the park, and we will honor that like we said we would. Thank you. So thank you for allowing us to present here today, and Mr. Chair, thank you for extending the time and giving us a little more opportunity to get into some details that wouldn't have been possible. So the reason that concern arose out of some of the park levels was, as you know, because of some 2006 private sampling data, which showed some exceedances for dioxins and furans in the park, the culvert inlet and outlet area. Now, the reason those samples were taken is that they were taken in relation to an ultimate lawsuit that involved Wausau and Sentry Insurance, and numerous plaintiffs had alleged illness, including cancer and in some cases death, stemming from the property to the west of the park. And other residents, like myself, who were not involved in that suit, later became aware of those results. Now, the city of Wausau, and I'm not suggesting the committee, but at some point, city staff they were aware of this lawsuit, because when the city submitted its EPA grant in fiscal year 2013, as you can see, its prime health concerns for brownfields in the project area was actually our neighborhood, and they specifically mentioned the suit and deaths of plaintiffs, their families had gotten involved in the suit. So the city was well aware of this, at least some staff were. Now, residents also learned of contamination at the property west of the park at 3M Company, which included multiple oil and petroleum spills. Their consultant, Arcadis, had a diagram showing soil contamination in the park, in the soil at about 7 feet below ground surface. Of interest is also an outfall that is adjacent to the 3M company property. There used to be a sign there. It was outfall number 005. In recent times, that sign is no longer there, but we have a picture of it. So, you know, the bottom line, and once again, this goes to kind of, I believe, the core reason we were asked to be here today, to get some insight into what are the goals of our group and perhaps many in the community, and to determine over time if soil levels in the park have declined enough to now be within Wisconsin soil cleanup standard levels. Okay, so they were not before with these culvert samples, and we've got a spreadsheet from Mr. Thompson at the DNR later on who confirms that. They ran the numbers, we can see that. If that's the case, if the levels are now within the non-industrial exceedance limits, that would be very positive. That's what we would hope. But if not, we want to fully define the extent and area of the contamination which exceeds those standards. And then if there are additional exceedances or areas that need to be remediated, we'd like that to occur, at least to have controls put into place as the DNR normally would. So here's a unique opportunity in the neighborhood. You'll see some sampling. Now, keep in mind, this was from lay people. The lab was solid, but the sampling done was by lay people, so there's a caveat there. Nevertheless, I think what you'll see is that in some areas we've identified in the park, you'll see, compared to the limited sampling data in other residential areas in the neighborhood, what appear to be some elevated arsenic and chromium levels. Now, they're not exceedances, but what we would like to do is to ask the government, that's the municipal and state government, the city and the DNR, to help the neighborhood determine some appropriate residential background values for arsenic. Okay, it'd be very cost effective. The issue here is that several years ago, the DNR kind of began to use a USGS study of background levels in the state to kind of gauge, okay, what's the background for arsenic and so forth. So the arsenic exceedance levels, they went up tremendously, up to about 8 parts per million. Now, the trouble with that, with what we've seen in the neighborhood, is that the background values where I live in that section, they appear to be between 2 and 4 parts per million with the limited sampling data we have. And when the state had used these background values, they actually took, about 650 samples throughout the state. Then they took the highest one that they thought was not an outlier, which is shown in this comment from the DNR, and they said, there's our background value. So the unfortunate thing about that is it really says nothing about the background value for our neighborhoods. And if we could do this, determine a background arsenic value, we could then use it in the park assessment. This is the spreadsheet from Mr. Thompson at the DNR. The DNR was kind enough to run the numbers from the culvert inlet and discharge. And you'll see that the highlighted cells there those are exceedances. Now, I believe Mr. Thompson ran them against non-industrial, but if I recall, even when they were run against industrial standards, there was at least one exceedance, even using the higher industrial standard. So, you know, the DNR is aware that there were exceedances in the park, and I think what's noteworthy here is what were they basing these exceedances on? So this is based on a cancer risk level that's codified by the state in its Wisconsin soil cleanup standards. So when we say it exceeds because it is not within those lifetime cancer risk levels for direct contact. Now, I know there's talk about doing some penta tests in addition to dioxin tests, and I think the committee should be aware that when these dioxin levels were identified as being exceedances years ago, penta tests had also been run on the culvert inlet and discharge, and those came back as non-detects. Now, I would suggest asking the DNR about the difference in half-life and volatility between penta and dioxins, and that may be part of the answer there. But it does show that at that time, there was no indication of active leaching of penta from any unrelated structures, okay? So not telephone poles, not railroad ties, even though ties would maybe be more likely to use creosote. So the dioxin levels did have exceedances, but there did not appear to be any leaching from anything unrelated. Now this will get to one of our suggestions or requests. We had heard about kind of conservative exposure scenarios and, hey, you know, this is probably the highest risk scenario we can put together to calculate what the risk could be. But this is actually from a DNR internal email. A gentleman in Madison who does a lot of the work with the spreadsheet data and the RCLs, and he had said on the neighborhood levels when they were talking about some other things that absent in the data submitted are dioxin-like PCBs, so whatever dioxin risk was calculated from the submittal should still be considered an underestimate. So really, I don't think the committee was really informed of that at any point, but it does raise the question, if we really want to have kind of a worst case scenario conservative assessment, we would request that PCBs, those with TEFs, and I think city environmental staff and the DNR, they'll know what we're requesting, but we'd like to have those added if possible. So in terms of potential relevance of PCBs, you know, just with old machinery and equipment and oils and so forth, when Walico, when that site was demolished, when the S&E buildings were ultimately razed, there were approximately 28 industrial buildings on that site just west of the park, some closer than others. Those were all demolished. And now, as you'll see, there were also 2 to 3 3M company industrial structures that were also demolished very close to the park. One looks like it may be kind of in the footprint of the park at the moment. So what you'll see here is the top is a aerial photo approximately from 1974 of the park and the adjacent industrial land. Below you'll see, I believe it's from 2016, a relatively recent image. Now when we overlay these with some transparency, it may be hard for the audience to see back there, but this is also online. You can see, I mean, the 3M structure kind of to the northwest area of the park, that was demolished. It's practically in what we would consider the forest of the park right now. I will attempt to use the laser. Yes.
This thing?
That's correct. Now, Mr. Peckham, the building that is just slightly up and to the left, that odd triangular looking building, yes, that was also demolished. Now that was a cold storage building at one point, but that is the building because no one else would take it because it contained dioxins that S&E and their consultants stored hazardous waste with dioxin in it, specifically at that narrow point in the building just adjacent along the park and not far from the culvert. This may also be hard to see from the audience, but it is online. We used the Marathon County land mapping tool site with GIS data and so forth to overlay the elevation data in the neighborhood showing both the park and the industrial land. And what you will see is consistently that the elevation in the park is obviously lower than the industrial land to the west. In fact, there are areas that are notably lower, and they corresponded with the ponding that we were able to videotape at one point. Now this stormwater map, this was used when the DNR and the city were planning out where they were going to put kind of basins after the Thomas Street construction was done. And it's very relevant because, and quite detailed, you can see, and the laser is a little weak. May I?
Sure.
Thank you. So the culvert is just above River Street. You can see it there east of the retention.
Chair, if you could put on your microphone and pick him up while he's up there. Get him
Take
on.
the handheld mic, Mr. Kelly.
Oh,
Tom?
yes. Thank you. Thank you. And what you can see at the culvert right here, if you see the culvert, that's correct. They had actually mapped the drainage network, so you can see where the water flows from the culvert area, and it actually goes east once it hits the park. Okay, so from there it goes down through the woods and east. And that may be significant when looking at some of the potential test areas. Now, this was from a 2000 photo, aerial photo, which also, when you take a close look at it, you will able to see some areas on the western industrial property that do suggest runoff from the property going east into, or at least near the park. Now, those also corresponded with video and photo that we had later taken, so this can also be a useful tool to help you perhaps narrow down some of these locations where runoff may have gone into the park from the industrial area. This is one of our own photos taken from a video, and you'll see that in that area where elevation is low, that there was ponding during and after rain events. Right there. Now, that was stemming from the forest area, actually just where elevation data and some of those aerial photos suggest. Now, there was an interesting phenomenon after that runoff dried, and it tended to leave kind of a gray silty residue on foliage. I have noticed this at 2 to 3 other properties in the neighborhood, this type of phenomenon. It could be useful at a later date. But because of the consistent runoff and ponding and this phenomenon, we decided, since we could not afford some of the more expensive tests, that we would run some metal tests kind of to use as a proxy and see what was going on. So you'll see that first set, there are 4 sets in these lab samples. Here we go. So the first one was in the runoff ponding area shown in the pictures of the park. And that had by far, in fact, nearly double or more than double the arsenic or chromium than the samples we took in other residential lots.
When were these done?
I believe it was October 2018 the samples were taken. And not to be disrespectful, but we had requested a presentation with the city after we had taken these to present this data, and that invitation was denied. So below that, you will see kind of a fairly high, none of these are exceedances, but you will see a higher lead level, and that was taken close to the Thomas Street road area. That's one reason the lead was higher there. And below, and this is a good thing, we did take some samples of arsenic and lead kind of near the playground area in Riverside Park just to make sure that those weren't too elevated because of kids playing in that area. All in all, though, you will see that the arsenic and chromium is significantly higher than other areas just in this limited sampling. And that arsenic level, that's at 6.1. So even with the quite high background value arsenic that the DNR now uses, 8, it's approaching that. That's at about 4 inches in depth. Also, in terms of chromium, we did run a hexavalent chromium analysis on that sample as well. Unfortunately, because we really don't have many resources financially, we had to use one that really was not very sensitive. And the good thing is it did not show a detect, but with that level of chromium, perhaps we could ask the DNR about what they think in terms of doing something more sensitive, and actually it would be quite a bit more expensive. This is, and I won't take up too much time on this since we discussed it last time, but this is in the northwest area of the park where the outfall sign used to be, and you can see that potential discharge area right below the sign. Now, one thing, and I'll ask Mr. Wausau and perhaps the DNR, we didn't have time to get into this, but 3M did have a fairly large remediation system just west of the park on the north side, cleaning up oil and fuel spills, etc. On the left is kind of a conceptual diagram from 1992, and if you can see that on the right of that first diagram, it says that the effluent would go to the stormwater sewers. And we would like to know from the city and the DNR, we've been looking into this, it's been hard to chase down. We would like to get an accounting of any manholes or sewer systems in which 3M Company discharged treatment effluent, particularly since we've been having some trouble in the sewers in the neighborhood, which I hear is mainly from Walico's Penta. But nevertheless, it seems like it may be something thorough to do. And also during this period of time, you know, they had a seepage bed and so forth. They were adding nutrients to it, you know, carbon filters. It was quite a massive spill, it looks like, from a layman's perspective. We'd like to know what the stormwater management plan was from that period, right? That kind of makes sense. Common sense. Let's see if we can get from 3M or the DNR what their stormwater management plan was, and see if they can be helpful on that. And if not, we could reach out to Mr. Bullard at 3M, who has told me in the past he would try to help the community if we requested it. Now, this is quite important. So during the toxicological assessment of the levels in the park and so forth, really the culvert inlet and the outlet were front and center. And it was very hard, other than maps, to kind of determine where that culvert inlet was in reality. I mean, no one seemed to be able to pinpoint that precisely. There were maps of it. I even heard someone may go out and try to find it. And it was our understanding, as well as I believe the city's, that the reason that the culvert inlet level was not used as the worst case scenario was because it was fenced in and therefore inaccessible to the public. So last week, when I and another volunteer were walking through the neighborhood, we had the opportunity, and it's not the first time it's happened, to get some good insight from a long-term resident in that area who was kind enough to show us where this culvert inlet was. And we were both very surprised. As you can see, now this is hard to see unless you're up close to it, but it was covered with brush and foliage, so naturally it would be hard to find. I would argue if someone like the city had spent 10 years trying to find it, I would assume they would have found it at some point. But we were surprised to find out that that's the image from the lawsuit, the initial sample. That actually it's not fenced in, and actually it's not on industrial property. It's very close to it, but that's me looking west from the culvert inlet right there. There's the fence. So this is not fenced in at all, and it begs the question, with the fence, when was that put up? Who put it up? Is it along the property line? But it does beg the question, so who actually owns the property right now that that culvert inlet is sitting on? But kind of more concerning than that is that's me looking kind of south-southeast there, and that area in the upper right corner of the photo, that's actually a residential yard. So, I mean, you can see that the distance from that culvert inlet, which was the highest level found off-site, off of the Waleco site, that it's actually not fenced in and it's close to a residential neighborhood. So I think we should at least look at how this perhaps impacts the testing scenario and assessment and so forth. And I certainly won't kind of speak for Dr. Zhang or any other toxicologist. I'm just a layperson from a modest neighborhood. But you may want to inquire with her that had she known that that inlet area was not fenced in and that it was quite close to a residential backyard, would she have used that as the highest level for the residential scenario? We will also try to ask some toxicologists and see what their judgment would be. But in doing so, initially 47 parts per trillion was used as the highest residential level exposure scenario. But if the culvert inlet value was used hypothetically, then run through the calculations, it would appear to exceed the threshold the toxicologists had defined for children in backyards. And once again, we are not stating that Dr. Zhang would have done that, would have used that value anyway if she knew it wasn't fenced in, but it might be a good question to ask. So getting to some testing suggestions here. We suggest using kind of a 3-zone area, particularly given the fact that we now know that culvert inlet area, at least informally, is on city park property right now, and that it's east of the fence, to use that zone along the fence. So west of the forest, where we know that those were the highest levels around that culvert inlet, use that to take a thorough set of samples for dioxins and furans and perhaps PCBs. Then looking at the second zone as the wooded area or forest below it. As you may recall, we saw kind of the structures nearby and in that forest in the case of one 3M structure. And just given, for anyone who's not aware, the 3M company here, that site was purchased in 1929, and impressively, that is the oldest working 3M factory in the entire world. Okay, so that's an impressive factoid. But before that, it was Wausau Abrasives. But I think we just have to be pragmatic in understanding you've got nearly a century of heavy industrial companies immediately west of the park and almost right on top of it at times that were using a series of chemicals. So the phase one, I'd like to thank REI and Mr. Lassa. I think it opened some doors on looking at what the history was of the park. This would be a suggestion, because the exceedance of that culvert inlet and other areas in the neighborhood, that was taken at a 4 to 8 inch depth. And I guess what they call the A horizon, that's Greek to me, but I think it means topsoil, essentially. Now, dioxin methods, test methods that had been used in the neighborhood, which had been used to identify some of the exceedances, it did use a method called 1613B, and that's slightly more costly, just slightly than other tests, but it is more sensitive, and because we're dealing with residential levels that could be quite low but still of concern, it may make sense, and we would request that the more sensitive tests be used. Also, and perhaps we can ask Mr. Lassa a question about this, But there is some concern about using composite sampling on any of the samples simply because, if it was trying to get kind of a representative value where the soil's kind of the same at different depths or areas, perhaps that would make sense. But the concern is that we're looking for hot spots, so we really would want to see discrete grab samples, individual samples taken, analyzed, not mixed together and kind of average. We're afraid that could dilute some of the levels in particular areas. And we're really not sure about the rationale at this point and what the deeper sample depth may be. So I think any information REI would provide on that would be useful. We're requesting that a citizen monitor be present during sampling events and that split samples be provided. Essentially, that we be given a set of samples taken at the same time, should be fairly easy, put a little extra dirt in a cup, that we can store away, will preserve the chain of custody, just in case we may decide to run those too at some point. And then we'd also ask that there be an inclusion of mercury in metals. That was a metal of concern at the Wausau site, I believe. And we'd also like to ask if, on number 2, these will be included because all of these contaminants here, they have been associated in DNR records with sites west of the park. One volunteer had a question about titanium dioxide in some of the 3M products that were listed in the data sheets, the product data sheets, and we just kind of like to ask because we don't know if that's of any implication to this scenario. But once again, I think even based on what the DNR communicated in their internal email, we would like to get those dioxin-like PCBs with TEFs added. And that is the data we put together for the committee and the community, and we hope it was of some value. Thank you.
Under the wire by 2 minutes. Very good. I guess, why don't we start out, Mr. Lassa, do you have any reaction you can give us to that? Maybe just come up, and the committee may have additional questions also, but there were a couple of things, I don't know if you were making notes or not, but
A few notes. Some of the substances that Tom had indicated, we did have in our proposal, VOCs, pHs. So there's a number of those parameters that were in the proposal.
very
to
good.
be
Is
some-
there any problem in adding like the dioxin-like PCBs or any of that other stuff?
I would have to look into costs and, because we had some dioxins, furans, but there's a whole list of those. There are many, many compounds in that as to make sure that that particular substance is included in that analysis.
Okay. What's your reaction to the proposal or the concept of doing some testing around the culvert area and then some testing, as I understood it from Tom, in the wooded area below 3M? And then I'm not sure where Tom wanted to go in terms of other zones. I'm assuming out in the flat area.
Our proposal was to collect a sample near the surface and one at depth. He mentioned discrete versus composite. They were not composite samples. They were to advance those borings and collect something at the surface and something at depth. He also referenced some indication of prior activities with 3M contamination. Some of that contamination was shown to extend onto the park property at depth, and thus some of the reasoning behind sampling at depth.
Okay. The reason the concept or the perception was that this was going to be a composite sample was what we were told at our last meeting, that it would be like maybe from 2 to 6 feet, that boring, or that kind of a cylinder of soil would be collected, and then it would be stirred up in a pot, and you would take out 2 spoonsful and
Well,
sample that.
You're correct in that there's an acetate liner that is advanced inside the rod, and it's withdrawn, and then you can pick sections of soil out of there, but you don't mix it all together.
Okay,
You're usually grabbing a sample from, 1 to 2 feet, or 4 to 6 inches, or whatever
Very
the
good.
interval is.
so that was a misunderstanding.
Correct.
Very good. And if you did, if you, knowing what you know, if you were going to do, say, the original 20 samples, did you have, take the time to map where those would be taken? Or did you just figure that that was the next step if we gave you the green light?
We could talk about specific locations, but due to some of the history of what has happened in the park, there would be some in various locations. There had been prior tannery on one side of the upper portion of the park. 100-plus years ago, there had been some of the other industrial uses that Tom had indicated. So they would be in a variety of locations to get a sample or sampling across the park, not just focused on one area.
Okay. Anybody on the committee have questions for Mr. Lassa? Mr. Neal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, just very generally speaking, we just received this presentation tonight and the document behind it just shortly ago, so not a lot of time to consume it, much less give it time to, cogitate. What's your reaction to the presentation we saw tonight?
Well, there was a lot of material that was presented. He also made a comment about DNR putting controls in place. I don't know if you wanted to further explain what those controls would be, but, in my opinion, controls are usually meaning not some sort of cap or some sort of exclusionary, to not allow people in there. So I don't know if you were referring to something other than that.
No, that was it, Mr. Lawson.
So, that ultimately, you're not wanting people to come in contact with this material. So, that.
Unless it were remediated.
Correct.
Okay. What were your feeling upon seeing that photo of the sort of gray film on the foliage in that runoff collecting spot?
I think that's more indicative of an aerial deposition, and maybe during a rain event.
It seemed pretty localized.
And on the top side of the, well, unless there was a lot of water that had come over.
This
that
was a
area.
pooling area. Yeah.
Pooling dried up.
When the
Yeah.
water evaporated, it left behind
Sure.
this. Now, that could just be, soil that was washed down
Correct.
the grade, but, the makeup of that soil, I guess, would be something definitely, in your testing scenario, I think you'd want to include as a suspect.
If you're seeing the 3M trucks that travel from the north side in there, you'll see a lot of white dust powder sometimes
Right.
on the road that looks similar to that.
So
Could be a silica type thing.
go ahead.
Yeah, crushed rock.
So if you took the borings and you decided that, as you had proposed, that take one sample for the surface, calling that like 1 to 3 inch depth, and if you kind of said, okay, the next one down, we're just going to go 4 feet, would you retain that sample? And so if you found worrisome levels at 4 feet, you could go back and test at 2 feet and 6 feet? Or what happens with that?
Well, the proposal did indicate we would have one within the top 3 inches, and then one was at depth. We would be field screening those soil samples to determine if there is volatiles there. There's not an effective way to field screen for metals or arsenic, things like that, but there is for volatiles. So if you were to, could we collect a sample and containerize another sample to be analyzed later? Yes. But the nature of volatiles, some of the VOCs, is that sample wouldn't be an accurate sample if tested, days, weeks down the road, because if there was volatiles in there, they would volatilize. That's the nature of the compound. The metals and other things, they're going to stay in that sample. They have a longer shelf life or a hold time, if you would like to call it that. So it depends on what you're sampling for.
Okay. Any other questions from the committee?
I would just add, 'cause I know we're looking at a firm recommendation from REI for a testing scenario, if I'm correct in thinking that. This information given to us in the presentation tonight, do you believe that would be added to your considerations when you're putting that scenario together?
Well, it's worth looking at. Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Nutting, did you have something?
Thank you. My thoughts always go back to what comes after testing. Should we test and discover, et cetera? Do we consider the next step, which is, for instance, what we've done at the Holtz-Krause landfill here in Wausau? The site was properly abandoned and remedied and capped, and now we have 15 soccer fields on top of it with a surface above whatever's left underneath there. What would be the future that we would see or should contemplate in this site, this location? If you could dream for me here.
Dream. There was some comments made in the presentation. I think it's accurate. If you look at some of the mapping where the property lines are versus where the fence is, they don't match. So there is a portion of 3M property that is beyond the fence, which maybe to the average person would think that that's the park, but it's not. So possibly, delineating what the park property is versus not would be maybe a first step. And then if there is, again, we talked about capping, but we also talked about, there have been other sites where they've just eliminated access or applied a cap like you suggested.
Yeah, in that case, it's clay that's brought in, soils, et cetera, and a certain number of feet. In some cases, you pave an area to remedy this situation, like it's a parking lot. And it's been done in various areas within the city along the Wisconsin River. But I just was wanting to see what one would suggest or what historically has been done in other scenarios of
What you
this.
said.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your new proposal, you indicate that they're going to do, 6 hydraulic push borings? Do you think that's enough to cover an area that wide if you're going to spread out and try to check various areas of the park?
I prepared that proposal of what I was asked for the number that was, the number of borings and the placements that were given to me on a map by others. So that was just,
Who were those others?
I believe that was the committee.
Yeah, I can explain that, and I think there's a little bit of confusion around it. We were asked last week, we were told that, things were set and that you were going to be providing your proposal, and that if, as he prepared that, if any of the committee members or city council people had any questions, we should ask. And so I subsequently said, should all these, should we just bombard the guy, or should everything go through like Eric Lindman's office or what? And they said, yeah, go through Eric. So I didn't see if anybody else asked anything, but I asked just so we would have another alternative to look at. What would it look like if you did 6 tests? And that was not to say, I want this proposal revised. The initial, we've still got the initial proposal that said sit and wait. We've still got the July 1 proposal that we do 20 tests, and now we've got one that we can consider that's at 6 tests. And I thought it was just be something that we should have before us to help us decide. And it turned out that the 6 tests, per test is more money. You're still talking a little short of $30,000. But it's an alternative that we can consider when we get to that point. If nobody has any further questions, did that answer your question?
Yeah, but I still have some more comments.
Okay, yeah, but it wasn't a revision of the original proposal, it was an additional alternative. And it came to us labeled revision, but it was really a, like a Plan B.
Okay, you said it came to us. Us is the committee?
Everybody, did it come to Eric and then to you, or yesterday afternoon as soon as?
Okay, so what I'm trying to determine, and it seems to be more difficult than I thought, is if it came to us, who did it come from? That's what I want to know, who it came from.
It came from me.
Okay, but somebody directed him to do a new one, right?
Right. I asked Eric to ask him, he said, what questions do you have for Mr. Lassa as he, fine tunes this? And I said, can you give us an idea of what this would look like if you started out with 6 tests? And so based on that request from the city, he prepared the document we received yesterday afternoon.
Okay, so somebody made an arbitrary decision that instead of having 20, we might consider having 6.
I did that. I said, what would 6 look like? I didn't say 6 was better. I said, what would 6 look like?
Yeah, well, I didn't say that. I simply said that somebody made a decision to ask him, what would it look like with 6?
Right.
And that was you, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, moving on. In your 1,400-page report, which is a real barn burner, I read it word for word, you, on page, let's see, let me find here. I got them marked here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. On page, starting on page 9 or 10 or something, you list a whole bunch of businesses. Some of them make sense. Walico, S&E, but then you list, in your listing, you also list Yonkers and Penny's and Domino's Pizza. How did those people get into your initial report? Certainly they aren't responsible for anything to do with what's
Right.
going on in Riverside Park, are they?
No, the Phase 1 standard and the federal all appropriate inquiry standard do require you to say certain records be checked within a quarter mile, half mile, 1 mile, so that's how they get in there. If you were to draw a circle or a distance around the park, all the records within that area, that's how they pair up. That's how that comes into the report.
Oh, so that's a federal reg.
That is federal and an ASTM standard for how the Phase 1 is to be.
Okay, well, the minute I knew it was ridiculous, I figured it was the federal regulation.
There are occasions where something considerable distance away can impact a property, and that's the logic. Sometimes you're looking at a property and the only issue is what's going on the property. Other times you can have contamination that is migrating from a distance away. Some of the Superfund sites, things like that. And so that's why you're searching those radiuses away from the subject property.
Okay, it just sounds like it would makes more sense that even certain businesses that fall within this perimeter that you exist, that Penny's and Domino's and Yonkers aren't really going to have much impact on the environment in Riverside Park.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. G.
Well, I think it's time to move on, so I will move that, and I guess I wasn't that familiar with but I know we have REI's proposal in front of us, so I would make a motion to accept and move forward the Phase 2 ESA report from REI for, in the amount of 20 testing for $71,149,000, just so that we now start, I think, with the Phase 1 report, with the Phase 2 summaries. I think the evidence is built that we need to have extensive testing in this area, and I would like to make that for the committee.
You can make the motion, and there can be a second, but before we get into the discussion very heavily, Mr. Lass, if you'd like to be comfortable, like in the first row, and be available to us, that'd be good.
I think a second would be appropriate, and then we can move on however
Okay.
the chair would want.
Very good. Got a second from Mr. Neal? Thank you. I would like at this time to call the mayor up and have him fill us in on if we, as a committee today, say that we would like to spend 71,000 or X dollars, even if it's 150, we probably have to go back to the city for more money, but if we ask for more money today, what the process would be in terms of where our request would go and his thoughts on that.
Well, I'm going to share with you an email that was sent to all of you by Kevin Fable, our environmental engineer here for the city of Wausau. It's as simple as this. I want this in on the record. The Phase 1 document, Section 8.3, identifies the potential environmental concerns with the property as defined by the ASTM Phase 1 standards and procedures. Section 8.2 identifies REI's recommendation to the city, which in short is to continue to allow access to the property for testing by TRC on behalf of Waleco, as required by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. The sampling by Waleco is being required by the DNR, and more future testing may also be required of Waleco by the DNR after review of the initial sampling results. Waleco would then be responsible for all costs associated with any DNR required testing, as well as remediation and cleanup costs mandated by the DNR as a result of that sampling and that testing. Now, the Phase 2 document is a cost estimate for the city to do voluntary sampling in Riverside Park, which is not required by the Department of Natural Resources. This cost estimate was for 20 sampling locations at a cost of approximately $71,000. And now, as Mr. Peckham had alluded to before, there has also been some talk as far as possibly doing 6 soil tests being conducted at an approximate cost of around $30,000. Because the sampling is voluntary, the city would then be responsible for this testing cost, not Waleco. If the city chooses to go ahead with the voluntary sampling, the city would be obligated to report the results to the Department of Natural Resources if any standards are exceeded. And then as owners of the property, the city would also be responsible for the cleanup and the remediation of any park property which exceeded standards, unless it could prove that another party was responsible for the contamination. Remediation costs could potentially run in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there could also be numerous legal costs incurred by the city in trying to assign the blame to any third party the city believes caused that contamination. Now, if the city chooses not to conduct voluntary sampling, then what I had just stated would not be a concern, because the Department of Natural Resources will be mandating that Waleco conducts the sampling. So Waleco would be responsible not only for the cost of that testing, but also for the costs associated with any cleanup and for any remediation mandated by the Department of Natural Resources as a result of that required sampling. Now, depending on what you folks want to do, it would have to go before the Finance Committee. I want this where it's open and transparent, and then on to the City Council. But something for everybody to think about. Waleco is already doing testing and everything in that area, and they're going to be. And if I had to give a recommendation, it would be for us to wait and see what Waleco's results are, because frankly, the cost would be on them. This is not something that was started by the city. This is something that has been directed in the last 3 years as far as being looked at in a productive and honest way to try to address our residents' concern in that area. We've done everything that we could in listening, trying to adhere, have testing done, whatever. My concern, if you want to call it that, from a fiduciary standpoint, if we start digging around in there, we could ultimately be responsible for everything, the cleaning up, the remediation. I think it's not the area in that sense that, we should be going into. I would think that we should wait and let Waleco take care of it. They're going to. It's just a matter of time. And it's going to be very expensive for the city.
Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Just one thing that might be a minor concern, but I wasn't aware of perhaps the inexact placement of fencing, and if that's being used as a determiner of what is, city property and what isn't, and is there actually non-city property that, kind of overlaps or intrudes into the park area? If we can determine where exactly our line is, and is there a zone there that looks like it's city property, but it's not, that we might, make sure that those areas are included in the mandated testing. If we can tell Wausau and the DNR, well, there's a strip of land here
That we're not sure where the property
that,
line
or that
extends.
we've determined that property line is, 20 feet or 30 feet further, east, than that fence or what have you. And there's some areas of concern, then we want those included in your mandated testing.
Fine. If that's what you would want, but I just want to remind everybody, we've really made a very conscious effort over the last couple of years to direct and try to address this issue. I've even been complimented by Mr. Killian a few weeks ago as far as that, something we inherited and that we're trying to address. But I'm also putting it out there in a realistic type of way. This could be very, very expensive if the city starts digging down there, and it's Walico's situation. And my recommendation, and I'm no soil expert or engineer or anything like that, but I've got a fiduciary duty for the city and its residents. It could be unbelievably expensive, and it could fall on us if we start digging down there for something that was caused by somebody else. Something to think about.
Very good. Thank you for that. Mr. Lasso, I was wondering if we could circle back to you for a question that kind of came to my mind. Could you tell us your thinking and rationale for your initial proposal for us to wait for Wausau? I mean, we pushed you, we got that, and then we
Right.
pushed you and said, no, we want testing. And part of that rationale was that we wanted more than the surface soil testing, we wanted it deeper. But what was your rationale on your original recommendation that we wait?
Because at that time, there was a submittal, or there was a request by the Department of Natural Resources for Walico's consultants to prepare a site investigation work plan as to how they were going to address the aerial deposition due to the burning of wood. And so they did an extensive historical study about where wind trends would go, and based off of that, they submitted a plan as to where they were going to sample. And to my knowledge, as of yesterday, I didn't see that those results have been given to the DNR if they've been completed yet. But they did have a plan based off of some wind modeling and some other things that they did to do some sampling within a certain area.
Was your thinking along the lines of what the mayor just brought up, that, let them discover it?
Well, they were going to come up with a plan as to where they believe would be potentially impacted and where they're going to sample. And, wait and see where they were going to sample.
And you didn't know at that time that there was only going to be one surface soil test proposed in Riverside Park?
Not at that time, because they
Okay.
were still preparing that.
Okay. Thank you. And going back, I guess the only reaction I would have to Mr. Killian's, you can sit again, question about the the test results not being considered at the inlet. I do remember Ms. Zhang addressing that when the question was raised of, if that was higher, why wasn't it, why weren't the calculations based on that? And I believe, Mr. Killian's probably got a better recall on this than I do, but I believe that the difference was 10 or 15%, wasn't it? Yes, sir. Yes.
It was enough to exceed their hazard threshold for children in a residential setting.
Okay. We can circle back to that with her. Have little other news, I guess, information for the committee to consider. I was able to reach DNR hydrogeologist Matt Thompson today, and I wanted to know if we chose to wait, what kind of wait are we talking about? Because the last thing I had heard, was that Waleco was trying to get data on a possible aerial deposition from sites such as Marathon Rubber, and, I thought, oh, God, this is going to take, a year and a half just to pull the trigger on doing the testing. But apparently, that went more quickly than it sounded like it was going to. And Matt Thompson says that the technical results from Waleco's testing, the testing that they ordered, is likely to be in DNR hands in September. And at that point, they're all just going to be a bunch of numbers that aren't going to mean a whole lot to us. But the DNR is going to take about 60 days to respond. And what he said was that everybody, literally, he said everybody from Tom Killian to Tony Evers is watching this. And so they're going to be very careful in their response in ordering possible remediation or next steps. And the question he says will be tough was whether the DNR will be able to assign responsibility for what they find. If they find levels of concern, how do they go back and say, okay, this is all on you guys, or it's over here, or whatever. So that's going to be one of the things, and he frankly predicted that it's going to be a big finger-pointing game as soon as those numbers come in, if there are anything that would require any remediation or action or expense. And I have asked him in the past, kind of, what should we do here, Matt? And the only advice he had for me today was to take an iterative approach, and he had to explain what that was. He said it means take one step at a time. And so it sounded like he was saying, take a step and then see what you get, and take another step and see what you get. So anyway, that's all the new information I have, but I think in terms of our consideration from here out, I think we should consider that we have 4 options. We can go with the original recommendation to wait on the testing, and perhaps, and I'm not saying this is the absolute best thing, but perhaps there won't be problems found, and we can all just breathe a sigh of relief and maybe say it's all good. I don't know. So we could wait. We could go with the 20 tests as the motion recommends. We could adopt something along the lines of the proposal we got from Mr. Killian and find out what that would cost us, how many tests would be necessary to hit those areas. Or we could start with 6 tests and do more if needed. So,
Question? Mr.
Go for it.
Mr., when we talk about the Waleco testing that's going on, that's with the aerial deposition, the wood burning effort that was going on, that's the testing that we're thinking that's going on at the present time, right? That's an aerial, just so that I understand what the Waleco testing that the mayor refers to, that you referred to also, that's the aerial the wood burning issue, the aerial disposition in the neighborhood and in the park. Is that right?
Correct. Technical memorandum work plan addendum number 2 that was submitted by TRC to the DNR on May 16th, 2019 had 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 different scenarios of air dispersion modeling from different things. And so based off of those models is how they were going to propose their sampling. Yep.
But the contamination that we've seen from Mr. Killian and also from your reports doesn't necessarily refer to, in fact, it's not aerial, but it most likely could be other types of contamination coming into that park.
Well, there was many types of contamination, many types of substances that were talked about. Some are naturally occurring, some are not naturally
Well,
occurring, and
Those not naturally occurring would be the issue, some of the things that we would most likely be, as part of your 20 tests, looking for, with, just launching off from what Mr. Killian is saying. With regard to stormwater, I'm not, but it just seems to me that those are really 2 different types of testing that we're going to be looking at. The sourcing of that contamination.
when we talk about 20 tests, it was 20 borings with two tests, or 2 samples collected for laboratory analysis from each one of those 20 borings, or each one of the 6. So,
I
yeah,
misspoke.
Just
so
so
that I
we're all
misspoke.
clear
Right.
on that.
The 20, we referred to it as the 20
Right.
borings, so,
The,
okay.
you would think that the samples that would be collected from the surface would be indicative of aerial deposition, and things at depth would be not, unless there was some sort of infiltration, which isn't common with metals, and dioxins and things tie up in the soils pretty, so you wouldn't expect it to move into depth. But there are other contaminants that Mr. Killian referred to, some of the petroleum products from 3M and things, that they may have hit the water table and moved, just like the wood preserved it, onto the park property.
So this basically these 20 borings could eventually say that, hey, everything is pretty well, that there's nothing to worry about, and, the slate is clean, except maybe for the Waleco testing that is also being done. So we don't know. I guess what I'm saying is we really don't know at this point in time, and I think for us to move into the future, I think we should know. And I think we should make sure that what we have in Riverside Park is indeed what we want to invite people to enjoy and recreate in that park. And I think this park committee should take that effort to make sure that indeed that is the park that we want to, the safety, the health of that park is indeed what indeed we want to present to the city of Wausau's residents. And I still maintain that the motion to move forward is appropriate at this time, knowing how it moves through finance and city council. We may find ourselves in September, but I think that we should at least prepare ourselves and move on and see what the final decision could, of course, be in the fall when the city council will make a final decision. But at least hopefully by then we'll know more. But I think we at least have to start the process this evening.
Thank you. I see Mr. Fable is gesturing that he would like to throw something in, and then I have a quick question of Mr. Lassa, and then we're going to go to Tom.
And then you go to me.
Okay, thank you. Just to address Mr. Gisselman's question about the petroleum-type contamination that would be subsurface, just so everyone's aware, that, and with that contamination, questioning, what that is or where it is, that, I just want to reiterate or make sure everyone knows that that petroleum spill has already been closed out by DNR, which means that DNR did the sampling around it. DNR looked at where the plume was, and with the safeguards in place, DNR closed out that spill, basically signing off on that spill being safe for park users with what's in place. So just wanted to make sure that
Very good.
everyone's
Thank you.
aware.
And then, Mr. Lassa, in the recommendations, both of them talked about getting some groundwater. And is the process, you would take a boring, so you would have a hole in the ground, then you would drive a point down until you hit groundwater? Or would you expect to hit it like in 6 or 8 feet? Do you drive a point down till you get groundwater to grab your sample?
Well, there's considerable elevational difference between the upper portion of the park and the bottom portion of the park. So where groundwater would be is a lot closer in the lower level. The sampling is basically a 2-inch diameter metal tube that there's a sleeve inside it. So you advance that, that hole will stay open down to the water table. When you get to the water table, then you're putting a well screen into that open borehole, purging that water out, and then collecting a sample.
Okay, so you go all the way down till you hit water?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And I think Tom was next. and
Yeah,
then
Tom is
Mr.
next.
Thank you. Well, I seconded the motion, primarily to make sure that the discussion continued. I'd like to propose to amend it in a couple of ways, I guess. One, I'd like to amend it to make sure, because the motion, on the face of it, seemed to be, let's go ahead with the recommendation that was before us, the 20 borings, as presented. And I would like to amend that 2 ways. One, to look at this scenario again with consideration given to all the information presented to us tonight by Mr. Killian, which might affect, the placement or manner and locations of these drillings. I don't know if 20 is like a standard number or an arbitrary number or something, that's very targeted. So I'd like to know, that. The second part of my amendment then would be to sort of satisfy the chair's concerns about perhaps can we streamline this too and look at if it's not, does it have to be 20 drillings? Can it be 16? Can it be 12? What are the implications of a sliding scale? So we have Plan B, Plan C to at least consider, and for the Finance Committee to consider, because we can make all the recommendations in the world, but they're the ones that have to look at it and say we can or can't afford it. So that's why I think we need, those options before us and before them. So that would be my amendment to the motion, and I, leave it to the committee to consider it. Thank you.
Yeah. Jamie just suggested maybe our motion could be up to 20, but Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The mayor brings up some valid points. They always say you should never look a gift horse in the mouth. I think this is one horse we should have given a total physical to before we accepted the property. Of course, this was a long time ago that nobody knew anything about dioxins or so on. But I think what we have here is we have a problem of trust. WELECO is going to be supposedly conducting these tests. I guess I would have to know how much input does the city have in what tests are conducted and how the results are presented, and how will those tests address the concerns of the citizens that put together this very impressive presentation tonight. That's my concern. WELECO, is on the edge of the knife here. If they come back and they find out there's a massive amount of pollution down there, they get the bill. And that's kind of like sentencing a man to be hung and tell him, go find a rope and then come back and see us. You may never see that man again. I know you wouldn't see me. So I'm just wondering, do we have any controls in place that we can control what WELECO says, and what is the time frame for that? This could stretch out to millennia. So I guess I need those questions answered if possible.
Closest I can come on that is what Matt Thompson told me, and he said that the technical results from the analysis would be in September, and then it'd be another 60 days before the DNR issued a response to it. So, yeah, we could do any kind of hybrid motion, like, maybe we really want 20 tests, but we're not going to pull the trigger until WELECO's results are in, or whatever. Is there a second to Alderman Neal's motion to, not sure if you want to hold off?
Oh, no, I'd like to go forward, and this really kind of addresses Mr. Alder Smith's concern in a way, because I do feel that, just trusting the opposition, if you will, to, play the game fair, gives me, pause, and I'd like to, have some control over our destiny too. And that's why, but the full out 20, it seems to me like a single option, and I'd like to have more options. So that's why I'm bringing forth this motion, this amendment of the motion, to give us more to look at, more to consider when we decide to pull a trigger or not.
So would you like to have this on the next agenda so we can consider all these things, having time to digest it, or do you want to?
Well,
I'm
first,
not
I
sure
think,
where
I
you're
guess
going.
I'd welcome a second to my motion to amend, so that we can consider
Let's
that.
figure out what it is first.
Well, I thought I'm pretty clear
it's-
with
it's
what I said
clear.
about it. Mr.
Well,
Gisselman?
yes, I will, I have some questions, but I will second that, especially with regard to, some of the information that was brought forth this evening. I have a question, though, Mr. Lasso. 20 seems to be an issue this evening. Is there a reason, as opposed to, with Mr. Neal's issue with 16 or 18 or 20, is that a standard number, or is there any way that you can reveal that kind of a number, or was it just, is that pretty much a standard number within the industry? Do you feel for the area that that's an adequate number to,
Our initial recommendation was to do none, to hold off and wait to
Right,
see what
I
the
understand
Wally
that.
go. Then we were asked to prepare an extensive, based on the size of the property, and if you had a half acre or quarter acre, you couldn't do 20.
Right.
So you would, I basically tried to prepare something that was extensive enough based on the size of the property.
so the geography of the park itself is
size,
extensive?
right, yeah.
Running from River Street or,
Right.
All the way to Sherman and even further north. So, I mean, it isn't just like you say, a couple blocks of property that we have to be dealing with, but it is an extensive area that may or may not yield for some issues. So how we determine that with regard to Mr. Neal's amendment is, I'm not sure, but I can certainly understand the amount of borings that we would have to, considering the land mass that is in front of us. So, thank
could-
you for that.
But to your point, you could ask, numerous environmental consulting companies, what do you think? And some might say 16, some might say 10, some might, there's no standard number of tests. It would just be an opinion of what you think is adequate to cover and characterize the property.
And that's your recommendation, that's your
It would-
environmental consultant's expert opinion with regard to covering the land.
It was in response to asking the request of us for something that would be extensive.
Right. Thank you very much.
I could just follow up, Mr. Lassa. When you're talking about the full footprint of the park, that really hasn't been the focus of our concern, really, because I think we've got information that kind of has zeroed us in on what I might say is like the southern half of the park, as to use the term hot spot suspect. Where we know that there was a plume to the north, but it's been addressed and cleared, and not really an imminent concern. We go all the way to the north end of the park, over by the bridge to the island. We haven't heard anything at all about that, so I don't know that I'm that concerned to pay to have a boring done over by the bridge to the island. My area of concern is really adjacent to where there was a large concentration of activity for a long time, that, right into our contemporary times, essentially. That being said, the number of recommended borings to me would be determined by suspect areas rather than, well, let's just cover the whole park, and see what it is everywhere. I think we need to zero in more, and that's why I'm asking for the recommendation to give me options in terms of how many borings there might be, and really why. What is their placement and why? Because that, to me, is a more informed decision for us to consider.
Then you should probably also have the conversation about what we're going to test for. Because we had an extensive list, and it seems like there are certain things that aren't of interest and others that are more of interest. So you can, shuffle parameters and numbers around to address whatever your concern is.
And that's why part of my amendment was for tonight's information from the presentation be brought into consideration in your scenario, so that, anything that might have been stated as a concern can be said, well, that really falls below the threshold of what we think, what we recommend, as your consultant, to be something that we should be looking at. Yes, there is a potential there for something to a certain level, but we feel, indications are it's below acceptable thresholds. We feel this is where our concentration needs to be. That's what I think we need from you and, from your organization, to really make, as I said, a targeted decision, not sort of a generalized one. So where's the borings? Where are the borings? Why are they there? What are we looking for? Based on not just the initial directions, but also based on the presentation which we got tonight, which I'm very happy that was brought forward. I appreciate it, but I'm not fully aware of its implications. That's why we have you. So.
So, in that light, is your amendment to direct him to come back to us with, this is where I would drill those holes?
Yes.
Okay. So could you just, for everybody's benefit, what would that finished motion look like, or sound like, or read like?
In the preparation of the boring scenario, and I'm not trying to be cute with that word, I would like the recommendation to bring into consideration information brought to us tonight by Mr. Killian and the group, and also, and prioritize that and recommend on the basis of what you feel is best, and also to provide us options in terms of the number of borings, because we have financial concerns that will have to be addressed by the Finance Committee, and that's why one single number is not really, helpful for them and for us. That's why it's good to know, what's the minimum number acceptable borings, not just what is a number. So, is that clear for my motion?
I got it. Has everybody got it? Any other comments or discussion? Mr. Nutting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two things, among others, there's two things that I've appreciated hearing tonight, Mr. Chairman, and that was the letter that the mayor read to us and his concern for a fiduciary responsibility. And then what I heard you say a few minutes ago with regards to a step at a time. And a step at a time, I would think that the first step we would be undertaking is to wait for tests that are in progress to be brought forward to us as a step. And considering the motion, the initial motion, which was put on by Mr. Gisselman, and that would seem to me not a step, but a leap into something that would be quite costly at this point in time. But we should take a step. I'm not going to support the leap. I would support an initial, a step at a time would be like a boring and another boring if necessary, and to analyze what we're seeing. But this is not an issue that is time is of the essence. This is something that has been here for quite a long time, and it will, if anything, be there for quite a long time. But I wouldn't support the initial motion, and I'm thinking, I don't have a clearer understanding about the amendment to the motion at this point in time, so.
I think the motion at this point is to bring us a more refined recommendation as far as the exact areas where the testing would take place. And
What would be
we
tested
would,
for?
you know, and what we would test for. And we're not pulling the trigger on any funding request at this point. It's
That's just
you know,
it.
let's learn some more, so we, you know, I think we've learned a lot today. We're, you know, we've been learning since January.
And we're going to be continuing to learn yet from information yet to come without
Yeah.
us having to
Yeah,
make it
and the
real.
problem, and Mr. Fable is gesturing that he has a contribution, but the problem with the waiting that we saw in June, at least, what I was sensing was that the Walico stuff is all in the first 3 inches of the soil. We want to know what's below that. So we can wait for Walico, that'll tell us some stuff, but we're still going to have the lingering concerns about what's below.
I just want to make it clear, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Nutting's concern, that the motion, both the original motion and as proposed to amend, are not motions to conduct testing. It's to prepare a testing scenario for consideration, but to prepare a different scenario than was originally given to us. So this is not a leap. This is waiting is not really a step either. This is a step to prepare for what we might do should we find that we want to do it. But, you know, when that time comes to decide, I want the decision to be as informed and as flexible as possible. That's what my motion is about. There's no motion here to do testing.
Right, I think we're being iterative, so that's good. Mr. Fable.
I just wanted to say something in regards to Mr. Smith and the concern he had. He had a concern of, Walico is the one potentially responsible for the contamination, so how can we trust that Walico will do the sampling that they need to do to uncover something that they might have put there? And that's not the situation. The situation is the DNR is responsible to regulate polluters. That's one of the reasons why the DNR exists for situations like this. The state mandates that DNR looks at contamination cases and regulates them, asks for sampling, asks for remediation, and when they're comfortable with that, they sign off on it that the property is closed out and safe. So if you want to go ahead with your own sampling, it's not that you don't trust Walico, it's that you don't trust the DNR to do their job. It's the DNR's job to regulate the polluters, authorize the cleanup, and sign off that the property is safe. So this really falls under the jurisdiction of the DNR. And those comments were just to address the concern that you had.
Okay, is the DNR conducting the test, or is Walico conducting the test?
Walico submitted the test plan to DNR.
I thought the testing was ongoing at this point in time.
No, Walico submitted a test plan to DNR.
Okay, but Walico did do the test and submitted the results they received from that test. Is that correct?
For the aerial deposition, no, that has not been submitted yet.
Okay, so what tests have been submitted and who conducted them before they were submitted to the DNR?
There's been ongoing sampling through groundwater and the 3M contamination. All that sampling has been done by consultants hired to do the testing, environmental professionals. All those results have been submitted to DNR.
Okay, but those consultants that were hired and paid, were they hired and paid by Walico?
They were paid by the responsible party, correct.
Okay,
But
who is the responsible party?
in the 3M contamination, it's 3M. In the Walico contamination, it's Walico.
Ah, bingo, there we go. Now we've determined that Walico did order the test and hire the consultants, correct?
No, DNR ordered the test.
All right. I feel like we're taking a step backwards here. But Walico is responsible for the results of the test. Is that correct?
DNR is asking Walico to turn in the sampling results. So Walico is responsible to get the testing done and they have to submit the answers to DNR. Then DNR takes those results, evaluates them, and decides whether they want to require more sampling, or if, based on the sampling, that no more is needed. Because ultimately, DNR has to sign off that the property is closed and safe if it's an open site. So in order for DNR to be comfortable to do that, they need to review the sampling results and make a determination based on those results. So
Okay, so basically, Walico, or the DNR will sign off on tests conducted by consultants that were hired by Walico.
correct.
Okay.
DNR will sign off on that if they're comfortable with the method and the results. And the sampling that is done, these DNR certifies the outfits that do the testing. So in order for a lab, or in order for someone to do sampling, they have to be on an approved list by DNR. They can't, well, whoever it is just can't grab a couple people from, the back room, go take some samples, send them to a lab that they want to. This all is on a DNR approved list.
Okay, thank you.
If you'd like to, we could ask the DNR formally to comment on their level of confidence in the test results that they receive from these independent consultants.
Well, maybe we should wait until the DNR gets back to us in September after they've reviewed the tests that are going on now or have been submitted.
Okay, well, once we've got them, yeah, you can.
I was simply
you can
trying to
say-
establish the fact that Walico is the first link in the chain. It's not the DNR, it's not, AJ Bozo and company, it's Walico. They're the
Right.
ones that were required to do the testing. They're the ones that must have hired consultants off an approved list, and then they must have, those consultants that were paid for and hired by Walico must have submitted that to the DNR.
Right,
They
the
will
short
then-
history on it is the Citizen for Clean Wausau brought up the fact that there were these tons and tons, hundreds of tons of treated wood burned. DNR, this generation anyway, said, oh, we didn't know that. That's a concern. So they ordered Walico to present them with a testing program. You go out there and propose to us how you're going to find out the extent of the problem that may have resulted from this aerial deposition. And then the DNR, I'm sure there was some back and forth, and the DNR said, okay, we approve of this plan that you have proposed. Go take the samples, send us the numbers. And so they're going to get the numbers in September, and they will, provide a response within 60 days.
Okay, so.
And it's a process that has, it has worked. So like, Kevin said, these are certified testing outfits, and they would be tossed out on their ear if they were fiddling around with the results.
Okay.
Question.
Anything else? We got
Well-
another meeting in here in 10 minutes, but we're doing
Well, I
fine.
just want to affirm that my motion did specifically say that we will be engaging REI in further soil boring or borings into the future. How we determine the number is yet to be determined after further meetings or reports, or with regard to Mr. Killian's input also with regard to how we proceed. But I think the motion basically says that we're moving forward with regard to looking at Riverside Park with REI's consultant, and how the borings proceed, we'll see. But I think that the motion is pretty clear with regard to our future movement with regard to how we move in Riverside Park.
I think the motion, as I understand it, is that we're asking REI to refine their recommendation as we've described and come back here August 5th.
But I'm not sure that if that's a Monday, if that's,
Can you come on August 5th? Monday, 4:30?
Mondays have been an issue before.
If it's, I can probably make arrangements that far in advance, but
Super.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, but it also, their proposal is going to take into consideration some of the points that were submitted on the presentation night by the Citizens for Cleaner Wausau, right?
Yes, and if they want to refine those, maybe Mr. Kelly can come to the microphone, but if they wanted to refine those to, some more specifics that we could get to him, I think that'd be fine too. Yeah, Mr. Lassa, there's not a lot of time between now and August 5th. When would you need, like, parameters for substances for which we would be testing, et cetera? In a week?
the committee's going to determine that, which parameter?
Why wouldn't we just, all my motion amendment is to take into account the presentation information when you go back to finalize your recommended scenario, to address that presentation material, make, just say yay or nay on these various recommendations, and come back with your final scenario.
I think most of the substances that Mr. Killian addressed are in the sampling protocol.
Okay. Yeah, and if there is anything new,
So then it's just a matter of locations, I believe.
right. And then that's why, my motion to amend really revolves around, a lot around the locations. I'm concerned about where's the line in reality? Is it the fence, or is it 20 feet to the east? Are we going to be essentially running a boring on land that the city really doesn't own?
You bring up a very good point in that, which should be something that is established.
Right. I mean, so that should be part of the recommendation too, is we have determined, where that line really is, via survey, verification, whatever. So I just want to press for the committee again, this motion as amended is for you to prepare, a scenario for consideration with options, for numbers of borings, again, because it's going to have to go to finance as well. So we're going to have to look at that and make a recommendation, and that's why it needs to be flexible and give us options and be very clear as to why the recommendations are there.
Mr.
I'd
Killian?
also point out, I'd like to have that a few days earlier for the members of the committee so we can review it, so it's not just given to us the day we come to the meeting. It doesn't give us time to go over it.
Right, yeah, this wasn't the greatest.
5 days.
Well, one, I wanted to say I do understand some of the mayor's concerns about this matter because this has gone on for decades. And the problem here, and some of us kind of had that feeling over time, right? Because how many facts need to be brought forward, that it really wasn't that there wasn't a problem. It was that the problem may be unidentified and in the park so poor that it exposes the city to financial liability and responsibility, and I understand this, and this goes back decades, and I'll tell you, the narrative about the DNR and the regulators, and they sign off, and you read the Walico files, read from about 1985 to 1993, regulators were scared at the DNR. By 1989, they were calling it a 5-year emergency, okay? And, Crestline identified the pentacontamination in 1978, and they just put it in a storage container and left it there for years. And when Sentry bought it, then they sued key shareholders for common law fraud and negligent misrepresentation. Larry Reardon was on that list, okay? So this wasn't a rosy fairy tale, and the DNR knows that we have discussed some of this air deposition study, and Walico, TRC, the consultants TRC there for Walico, they said they couldn't really sample Thomas Street from the air deposition study because the project You know, we knew that that's baloney. I mean, this is baloney. And if you Google Waleco, Google their address. It's 1800 North Point Drive, okay? So that's a pretty well-known address, and that is Century Insurance. And if you look at their VP in the 90s, that's Caroline Freebance, VP of Waleco. Is that on her LinkedIn page? I doubt it, because she doesn't want to be known as the Duchess of Dioxin, okay? This was a terrible problem. In 1986, the dioxin levels were 174 parts per billion. When I tell environmental experts that and I show them those numbers, they almost fall off their chair. Dow Midland, that was only 52 parts per billion at that time. So this was terrible, and people have been, I mean, there was a lawsuit. People alleged cancer and illness. 2 children with lymphoma who had grown up on River Street. I understand the city is concerned about this, and with good reason, but the community will stand behind you. You have a problem. It's a Waleco problem. It's a Century Insurance problem, and the community will get behind you if you do this testing. And I think Ms. Jacobson should call David Crass and Michael Best and tell them that we're going to do testing, we may remediate, and she'll see him in court. That would be my recommendation. But moving forward in the next week or two, we will be releasing information about Waleco's great testing and remediation plan in the 80s and 90s. So please check on that. Thank you.
Thank you for wrapping up. Can we vote on the motion that we have from Mr. Gisselman as amended by Mr. Neal with Mr. Gisselman's blessing? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? None. That was a unanimous approval. I'm in favor. And I was wondering if Mr. Neal would like to make a motion to direct staff to determine the property lines of the park.
Yes, as asked of the mayor earlier this evening, I would like to verify the exact property lines in question, both 3M and Waleco, so that I know where is city property and where isn't, so that borings that are, being planned, properly.
Very good. Second to that? Mr. Smith, thank you. Any other discussion on that one? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion to adjourn? Mr. Nutting and Mr. Gisselman. Thank you very much. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
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 Thank you. Thank you, everyone.